I'd like to welcome all of you to this symposium/colloquium on a project called the Jews of Cleveland, which I will explain to you in my welcome remarks. There's some basic situations here that Dr. Sean Martin and I want to explain to you. We will be in Baker Nord for 2 sessions today, plus lunch. And one of the things to know about Baker Nord, that the facilities are down on the lower level, and there's an elevator that will get you there. There are stairs that will get you there as well. This whole program, the symposium, which starts today and will wrap up tomorrow afternoon at the Western Reserve Historical Society, is really a collaborative project, and everything we're doing today is collaborative. It's presented by the Western Reserve Historical Society, the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, and Siegel Lifelong Learning here at Case Western Reserve University, the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage, and the Cleveland Jewish News Foundation. And what we are doing in these 2 days here are bringing together the vast majority of the authors of a book in progress. That book is tentatively titled The Jews of Cleveland. It will consist of an introduction and 13 chapters with 15 authors, and I'll let Dr. Martin explain 15 authors and 14 chapters, but we have 2 people working on 1 chapter today. That book and this symposium derive from conversations that Sean and I had with Alan Gross of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland. There are histories of the Jewish community in Cleveland. The first major one was Lloyd Gartner's History of the Jews of Cleveland. That was followed up by Merging Traditions by the late Sidney Vincent and late Judah Rubinstein. Both of those have gone through basically 2 editions. There are numerous other books that have been issued, and almost all of these have come out under the auspices of the Federation with the cooperation of the Western Reserve Historical Society. The Gartner book is a great book, but it is somewhat out of date chronologically, and so the question that was put to us was, should we hire somebody to add to the chronology represented in that book, or should we bring in somebody to rewrite the entire narrative of the Jews of Cleveland? And the decision we came to was to look at it in a different way, and that was to bring in a number of authors to write about specific facets of the community's history, whether it's suburbanization, the Orthodox community, or philanthropy. And to gather those experts not only from Cleveland, we have a number from Cleveland and Northeastern Ohio, but nationally and internationally. And so what we have in the works right now is an internationally composed series, collection of authors who are working on topics on the history of Jewish Cleveland. It will be an anthology. What makes the anthology possible is something that wasn't fully in place when the Gartner book was coming out. It was something that was simply nascent at that point, and that is the Cleveland Jewish Archive at the Western Reserve Historical Society. That was first formally established in 1976. It has since grown, and it is now an endowed program supported by the Federation. And that archive has accumulated hundreds of collections that were not available to Lloyd Gartner or any other scholars. And what we wanted to do with this project was to bring people in to utilize those incredibly rich resources, to mine them, and to create a book that would not only inform Cleveland about the Jewish community, but be of such academic stature that it would be accessible and of interest to scholars throughout the nation and around the globe. That's what we're in the process of doing. This colloquium is not a series of finished papers. We have authors who are talking about their concepts for their chapters, and we're bringing them together to introduce what they're doing to the community, but more importantly, so they can speak and work with one another, and then move on from this to actually work on the final chapters. We're looking at chapters in 2016 and publication shortly after that. I hate to let cats out of the bag, so to speak, but we have presented this concept to Indiana University Press, and absent even a chapter, they have expressed an interest in it. It's not obviously a promise of publication, but Indiana University Press has a strong body of material both on the American Midwest and an incredible Judaica publication set. So that's what we are about. So you are sitting here, if you're not part of the group writing the book, you're going to be introduced to, I think, a major work of scholarship coming out in Cleveland. And I dare say that this is really important also to the Western Reserve Historical Society, which has been publishing books since 1870. And the chair of our ad hoc publications committee, Dr. Robert Jackson, is in the back row, and the publications committee is overseeing progress on this and another book that's going on. And the last commercial before I introduce my colleague is there's another book coming out on Jewish Cleveland that will appear sometime this summer. It's a history of the garment industry in Cleveland, entitled A Stitch in Time. I thought it was a clever title. And this will be more of a coffee table, but very solid scholarly book. And I'm going to introduce the author of that book, who is chairing our first panel, to introduce the panel and move this program forward. Sean, if you will.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. It really is wonderful to bring everyone together, all of the authors for this project, and also so many friends of local Jewish history and those interested in the different topics that we'll be presenting today. We have grouped the panels very loosely thematically, and so our first session will focus on two papers devoted to 19th Jewish history in Cleveland. I'll introduce both of the panelists, and then I will have them each speak for about 20 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time left over for questions and comments. Catherine Hellerstein will be our first speaker. The title of her paper is The Rosewaters and the Colmans, Jewish Identity in Two Cleveland Jewish Families, 1850 to 1915. She is Associate Professor of Germanic Languages at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the former undergraduate director of the Jewish Studies program. She's a poet, a translator, and a scholar of Yiddish poetry, and her books include the translations of the poems of Moshe Leib Halpern, Kaja Malodowski, and she is the editor of Jewish American Literature, a Norton anthology. Following Catherine, we will hear from Peter Haas on Cleveland Jews in the Civil War. Peter is here at Case Western Reserve University as the Abba Hillel Silver Professor of Jewish Studies. He served as an active U.S. Army chaplain for 3 years and then remained in the Army National Guard for another 19 years. He's the author of Human Rights in the World's Major Religions, The Jewish Tradition, and Morality After Auschwitz, The Radical Challenge of the Nazi Ethic. He was also previously on the faculty at Vanderbilt University, and he was involved there in a project on Jews in the Civil War in the South. And so, without further ado, I will introduce Peter. You can speak at the podium or at the table as... Catherine, I'm sorry. Catherine is first. Yes, thank you. Catherine is first, as I said. Wherever you like, Catherine.
The podium's probably better if I can balance all the objects in my... Wait, I do need my water. So I'm really honored and thrilled to be here this morning. This is just a fantastic project and a fantastic occasion. I'm planning to write a study of two 19th century Jewish families in Cleveland from which I descend. The Colmans and the Rosewaters immigrated to the United States respectively from Bavaria in 1840 and from what is now the Czech Republic, but near Prague in 1854. They were fleeing religious persecution and seeking economic opportunity. Both families settled in Cleveland, established businesses, and along with their numerous offspring, played significant roles in the establishment of Cleveland's cultural and Jewish communities, as well as those of other Midwestern cities. Samuel Loeb Colman, for example, was a founding member of the first Cleveland congregation, Anshe Chesed, and later commissioned the writing of a Torah scroll. Marcus Rosenwasser became a prominent obstetrician and medical professor in Cleveland, and his younger brother, Nathan Rosewater, was also a Cleveland physician. Their brother, Edward Rosewater, served as Abraham Lincoln's telegrapher during the Civil War and went on to become a newspaper editor and politician in Omaha. my article will take the form of a family narrative spanning a 75-year period from 1840 through approximately 1915. The story of 4 generations in 2 intersecting families of Ella Strauss Colman and Samuel Loeb Colman, and of Rosalia Cohn Rosenwasser and Hermann Rosenwasser, will offer, I hope, a case study of ways that Central European Jewish immigrants became American in the mid-19th century through acculturation, education, and the development of their professional, social, and religious lives. As much as it considers the question of Americanization, my essay, I hope, will also attempt to answer complementary questions of how and why and to what degree most members of these 2 families chose to remain Jewish. I've conducted preliminary research for this essay in the Colman family miscellany, which is here, and the Colman-Schwarzenberg family scrapbook, both of which are here at the Western Reserve Historical Society, and in the Rosewater family papers at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, although I haven't been to Cincinnati. I got microfilms a long time ago. And also we have a trove of papers and other things in possession of my own family. As a scholar of literary texts and history, I'm going to approach this topic through readings of archival documents like letters, diaries, journalism, and other writings, as well as by looking at objects like scrapbooks, photographs, and art. And I hope that through the readings I offer, I'll be able to unpack the social, cultural, and religious ramifications of the development of the family members' Jewish and American identities. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to give you an example of the approach I hope to take by looking at a letter that Edward Rosewater wrote from Washington, D.C. to his girlfriend, Leia Colman, in Cleveland in 1862. The letter from Edward Rosewater to Leia Colman that I'm going to talk about is a keyhole through which to consider how one young Jewish man at a crucial moment in American history presented himself to his beloved young girlfriend. And Rosewater, I should say, is the only known Jewish telegrapher in the Civil War. And he was also, as I wrote some time ago, and as Jonathan Sarna quoted me, I was so proud and happy to see in his brand new book, Lincoln and the Jews. He was also the person who happened to be on duty who telegraphed the Emancipation Proclamation. The letter reveals the texture of everyday life lived by immigrant Jews in Cleveland who had, in a matter of years, transformed themselves from immigrants into middle-class Americans. At 3 a.m. on September 18, 1862, while on duty for the night in the War Department telegraph office, young Edward Rosewater began to compose a letter to his 17-year-old beloved Leia Colman in Cleveland. Rosewater, who was 21, had very recently arrived at his post in Washington, D.C. Having joined the United States Military Telegraph Corps in April 1862, Rosewater had served in the field over the past 5 months under 4 generals, first Rosencrantz at Wheeling, then Schenck, and later Fremont. Finally, he had marched with General Pope to Richmond, Virginia in August of 1862. As a military telegrapher, Rosewater placed telegraph wires along railroad tracks and operated telegraph stations that enabled the Army to communicate beyond the battlefield. This work incurred real risk, as he wrote, and as he later recalled in a 1905 lecture he gave to the Telegraphers Association, he said, "The Army telegrapher, when he was in the field, was either always in front of the Army with the advance guard, planting his wires as well as he could, or communicating as fast as he could to the various parts of the field where wire communication could be gotten, or he was in the rear of the Army. When there was a retreat, he was the last man to leave the field because he wanted to keep up communication." And there's some great stories about Rosewater almost getting caught, but that's for another time. Indeed, during the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, in which 25,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, Rosewater performed a dangerous train mission to investigate the situation at Manassas. And when General Pope withdrew in defeat, he remained at his post in the Fairfax County Courthouse telegraph station. As the Confederate soldiers swiftly closed in, he had to flee without his luggage. During the few days he served under General Fitz-John Porter, Rosewater witnessed more than 10,000 wagons caught between the armies of North and South, crushing each other, going in all directions on good and bad roads, before he was transferred to Washington in early September 1862. As he writes in his letter on pilfered War Department stationery, the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, was in progress, and the news of that battle was coming in on the telegraph instruments that he tended. Now, I'll just read you a little piece of this letter, and you'll get a sense of Rosewater's style, and then I'll make one more statement and close because I see the time is passing. He says, Miss Leia Colman, as usual, you delay answering my letter, and I get impatient and write before receiving a reply to my last letter. I must excuse you on the grounds that you suppose me to be in some fort near the city, as you might expect from what I said in my last letter 2 weeks ago. Therefore, you thought plenty of time to answer my letter. If you knew with what anxiety I looked into the letter box, perhaps you would gratify me by writing oftener. Besides, I never got your letters written, as you said, when I was with... Okay, so he complains. This guy has just been through this traumatic battle experience over the last month and a half. The most bloody thing in the world is going on, and stuff is coming in as he's writing, and horrible things are coming in over the telegraph, although he may not have been able to interpret them as he's writing this letter. But he complains to his girlfriend that he hasn't heard from her, and she's not writing him long enough. This actually doesn't show that he was in denial or superficial or anything at all. I actually think it shows that. Pardon? What? I think that it shows that it shows in this incredibly eloquent, rather formal Victorian English that he is very comfortably an American, and he's very much in his own body and in his own situation in life and in his own shoes. In another occasion, perhaps when I publish this or whatever, you'll hear all the details of his life. But he was a guy who didn't have much education. He was 13 when he arrived in America. His formal education was 3 months at a sort of business school in Cleveland, and then he apprenticed himself to a telegrapher, traveled all over the Midwest and the South, learning how to operate and install the telegraph until he ended up, by luck, after the battlefield experiences in Washington. I guess there's one other quick passage I want to read to you really quickly because it's a beautiful description of Lincoln. He describes in the same letter to Leah Colman, the President, Secretary of War, and General Halleck come in occasionally, after he's said how many beautiful carpets and books, including Roget's Thesaurus, happen to be on hand in the telegraph room. The President every morning about 8 o'clock comes in to read the dispatches, which are copied into books. His house being next to this, he is here often. Last Sunday he was here all day with his white satin slippers, common black suit, and spectacles on. He looks funny, comes in and asks operators all kinds of questions. Sometimes he tells an anecdote or reads a story aloud and laughs. You could hear him half a mile. Well, so much for old Abe. Okay, so we have this lively young man in the thick of battle who is able to articulate his love for this girl, and at the end of the letter, he does describe Washington, wartime Washington. The church is full of wounded, and But he also describes and the battleship on the field, which he on the river, which he gives a half a sentence to. But he also describes who the actors and actresses are playing in the light comedies on stage in Washington, and he complains about his living arrangements and the cost of rent and food. At the end of the letter, he turns back to his girlfriend and her sisters in Cleveland, and he talks about, he imagines that perhaps you are playing mill, he says to her. If you were playing mill much nowadays with young men, of course, whom you can beat, I can be played out when I see you again. Nobody here knows how to play it, he says to Leia. So poignantly and simply, I think he reveals how homesick he is, supposing that Leah's becoming more practiced at mill, probably the mill game or nine men's Morris, like tic-tac-toe and checkers, and that she's playing it with other young men. He praises her intelligence and skill while putting his competition in their place. Unlike Rosewater, the young men who are still in Cleveland have not experienced the danger, discipline, and hardships of the war. Leia can surely beat the inherently inferior Cleveland boys, Rosewater implies, yet he worries that when he returns home, she'll be able to beat him too. Ostensibly, he'll be played out, he says, because nobody here in Washington knows how to play the game. But the phrase that he writes contains undertones of an anxiety that goes beyond the parlor. He then goes on to talk about her sister, Leah's sister, Nanny, her two sisters. Nanny, he asks her to give Nanny my respects if she is for the Union. Betty, I hope, will not allow her beaux to be drafted, but volunteer in their defense. So whether Betty has one or several admirers is not clear. You can't read the handwriting very well. The teasing tone, though, that Rosewater takes on about the two sisters and their boyfriends or their allegiances, again raises an issue underlying his lightness. A volunteer for services in the military telegraph corps 6 months earlier, he disparages the young men who aren't involved in the war, and maybe even avoiding the draft by paying a fee. And by calling his future sister-in-law Betty a more soldierly spirit than her boyfriends, he conveys admiration for Leah's younger sister, who can speak her patriotic mind but can't go to war. Betty will defend her boyfriends against both the Confederate Army and the Union Draft Board. As a military telegrapher rather than a soldier, he's aware that his own status is ambiguous. They're not considered an integral part of the Army, and they don't get the veterans' benefits that the soldiers will get in the end if they manage to survive the battle. But then he ends his letter by asserting his own sense of his virtue as a volunteer. You, I know, he says to her, you, I know, to be so patriotic you won't have but a volunteer in your defense. With this statement, he also confirms his affection for her and his certainty of hers for him. He closes in decorous warmth, with all regard I possess to you, and signs, yours truly, E. Rosewater. Do the focus on culture, decor, the dry wit, and the restrained affection reflect the real Edward Rosewater? Other sources reveal that he develops a hot temper, he's a good fist fighter, he's curious about the lives and ways of Americans in the South before the war began. Or is his style an instrument for courting the imagination of his reader, Leah Colman, whose presence and character emerge from what he chooses to tell her? The letter hints at their future marriage, ambitions, adventures, achievements, and tragedies. It also attests to all that Rosewater had achieved in his 8 years since he arrived in the United States. For one, the letter's clear, eloquent, yet intimate prose contrasts with that of the diary that he kept from the day he first left Cleveland on October 18th, 1858 through 1863, which other people have called telegraphic, badly written, incomplete sentences. But I actually think that, that his diary is as rich and nuanced and open to reading as this letter. Writing to Leia from the War Department, Rosewater, the immigrant Jew, has found a comfortable idiomatic voice in English, a voice that foretells his success as a Midwest journalist and a politician in the coming decades. And what I hope to do in my essay is not to spend that much time on every single item, otherwise I'll write a 3,000-page book, which nobody will want to publish, but to be able to select and read closely and place into context key texts of the family, of the families, the Rosewaters and the Colmans, and to show how they become American in their writings. They engage in issues and conflicts of identity. I didn't really talk about the Jewishness here, but that's for another time. And that's where I'll stop. Thanks.
Do we need to do sound check, or are we okay? I also want to wish you a good morning and welcome you to our campus. As just a few words before I get to my actual presentation, but as Sean said, I worked at Vanderbilt University for almost 20 years, and I did a project there on the Jews of Nashville and that area of Tennessee in the Civil War, of course, from the Southern point of view. And so this seemed like an interesting project to kind of see the other side. One of the differences here is that when I was working in Nashville, there were actually battles in the area. And there was a field hospital, and I mean, it impacted the community very, very directly, which of course is not true for Ohio in general, but certainly not for Northeast Ohio. So I've shaped this paper a little bit differently than I might have otherwise, in that I want to talk or think about, or invite you to think about the Civil War more generally, and what kind of impact it had on America, but more specifically in Ohio, and I then will focus in on Northeast Ohio and a couple of soldiers. So far in the project, I've gotten to the soldier part, but I think there's some aftermath in terms of, and other side events that need to be looked at, maybe the garment industry or other kinds of things that engage Northeast Ohio, because the Civil War is more than just the war. It's supplying and sustaining the war and dealing with the aftermath. So that's still some of the work I have to do. But I want to start off with the larger picture and kind of frame, in a way, how Jews interacted with this event in their new home country. So I think there's little question that the Civil War is in many ways a watershed event in this country. It still, in maybe all too many ways, still shapes our political, our social, and our racial discussions. It was also a watershed event in the history of Western warfare because it was the first war that was fully industrialized, and especially the use of railroads. Railroads made it possible, and this is a big deal, railroads made it possible to bring unprecedented numbers of men and amounts of materiel into fairly small battles. The effects of this technological innovation are apparent in the numbers. 23,000 casualties in the single battle of Antietam, 35,000 at Chickamauga, 51,000 at Gettysburg. I mean, these are massive numbers to be lost in a day or two. And these are only the casualties, so it's a small proportion of the number of soldiers actually there. There were arguably more casualties during the Civil War than the United States suffered as a whole in World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined. And of course, all these soldiers needed to be equipped with uniforms, boots, rifles, ammunition, canteens, and so forth. The war brought, we might say, an industrial revolution as well. Given the massiveness of the war and the trauma it caused, it is of course natural to ask about how all this affected the Jews. What role did Jews play in the war, and what was the effect of the war in that community? Given that Ohio was one of the largest states in terms of population at the time, it of course played a significant role in the war on both sides, Cincinnati being more oriented to the south than the rest of the state. But my focus is going to be on Northeast Ohio, and here the sympathies were decidedly northern. In many ways, the story of Jews in the American Civil War is that there is really no story. Jews fought along with their neighbors, whether in the North or in the South. It's not so much a matter that Jews were for slavery in the South or were abolitionists in the North, though these debates, as you may know, did reverberate among Jews. But Jews were still largely an immigrant or maybe first-generation population. They wanted to fit into their new homeland, and they obviously had social and economic interests at stake. And so Jews enlisted, fought, were wounded, and died just like their neighbors. Now, to be sure, there was some anti-Semitism afloat. All military chaplains had to be Christians, for example. And there was, of course, the infamous General Order Number 11 of Ulysses S. Grant. But on the ground, Jewishness did not seem to have been much of an issue for anyone, Jew or Gentile. Maybe if there is a story, that is it. Unlike the long tradition in Europe, American Jews in the Civil War were not Jews. They were Northerners or Southerners. So let me start with the community in Northeast Ohio. The community is, as well agreed upon, began with the arrival and permanent settlement of Simpson Thorman from Unsleben in 1837. He is credited not only for being the first permanent Jewish resident of Northeast Ohio, but also having encouraged some 19 others to follow. So in 1839, he kind of instantly created a community. Simpson's success in this regard, of course, did not come out of nowhere. He himself came over to America in the late 1820s at the front end of what turned out to be a significant migration of peoples out of Central Europe, especially the German-speaking lands, to the United States. This immigration, which began in the 1820s, lasted up to the Civil War and brought something like 1.5 million German speakers to these shores. Among those were, of course, Jews, somewhere around 150 to 200,000. These immigrants came for a number of reasons, but mostly to escape the political, social, and economic upheavals and uncertainties of their homelands. These upheavals reached a peak in 1848 with a series of uprisings, rebellions, and revolts that we know as the March Rebellion. The Jewish migrants had among them had additional reasons to make the move. For example, to escape restrictions on Jewish life that persisted in many parts of Central Europe. It is thus rather an irony, or sad irony really, that in 1860, these German and German Jewish refugees escaping civil war in Central Europe found themselves facing another civil war. One priority among these German Jews was, of course, to assimilate to their new country. This drive was not only out of personal and social, but also out of very practical economic reasons. Many of these immigrants were engaged in commerce, the typical pattern being to begin as a peddler, move up to more permanent establishments, and so forth. In search of opportunities, these German Jewish immigrants moved west into the frontier of the time, west of the Appalachians to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, and of course, Ohio. This diaspora was very broad, but usually quite thin. It took many towns a while before there was a sufficient number of Jews to create an actual community, to buy a cemetery, for example, or to organize holiday worship services. But slowly Jews did enmesh themselves in the local societies and communities. If any of you have been in the South, in the small towns, you know it's still possible today to go through many areas of the South and Midwest and see small towns with synagogues or stores with Jewish names on them. When the Civil War broke out, Jews could be found on both sides of the conflict, naturally. Jews in the Confederacy, whatever their views on slavery, fought for the most part alongside their Confederate neighbors and business associates, just as in the North, Jews supported the Union. Jews also served at high levels in the Union, and sometimes even the Confederate government. I'll come back to that. Several Jews had been elected to Congress in the pre-war years, and Judah Benjamin famously was both a U.S. Senator, he was from the state of Louisiana, before the Civil War, and after secession was named Attorney General of the Confederate States, and then later on went on to serve as Secretary of State and then Secretary of War. This would probably have been unthinkable in Europe. I should note at this point that Jews voluntarily took up arms alongside their Gentile countrymen, and this itself was a rather new, although very largely unremarked phenomenon. There were, of course, some modern precedents for Jews in the military. In Czarist Russia, for example, the Jews were subject to the draft beginning in 1827 under Nicholas I. This was, to be sure, part of an attempt by the Tsarist government to break up the Jewish Pale of Settlement and assimilate the Jewish population. The Czarist draft underwent a number of transitions, but it eventually was lengthened to 25 years. This was hardly voluntary. And in fact, the stories of the time tell of the extraordinary length Jews went through to avoid the draft. Nonetheless, there were Jewish soldiers. Jews also served somewhat more freely in the Austrian-Hungarian Imperial Army, and some were even appointed to officer rank, but these were really exceptional. To gain perspective, it is helpful to remember that even in France, the first country to officially emancipate the Jews fully, had its own issues with Jews in the military, as can be witnessed some 30 years after the Civil War in the Dreyfus Affair. So to suffice it to say that for the vast majority of German Jewish immigrants in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, military service was the furthest thing in their experience or in their minds. It just simply wasn't part of who they were. So when the war was declared in April of 1861, this is the other side of the story now, the United States had virtually no standing army. And what it did was mostly Indian patrols out in the West, mostly cavalry. The total regular army of the United States at the time consisted of 16,000 men in total, mostly foreign recruits. Now, some of this number ended up in the South, maybe up to 25%. So the U.S. Army, if you think about it in those terms, was maybe 12,000 men in a standing army. Thus, both sides had to organize and carry out a massive recruitment campaign. This meant not only mobilizing men and to train them to become soldiers in short order, but it meant mobilizing industry, as I noted earlier, to provide uniforms, boots, rifles, ammunition, and all the other accoutrements of war. These were massive social events in both sides. The recruitment of men fell largely to the states. Since it was assumed at the beginning that the war would be of very short duration, many of you may know the first Battle of Bull Run, families came out with picnics to watch the battle. They figured that was it, and if you're going to watch the Civil War, you better do it now. The battle changed minds. Anyway, since it was assumed that at the beginning of the war that it would be of short duration, enlistment periods were rather short. Ohio was at that point one of the largest of the northern states, and so had a correspondingly larger number of units. Ohio was asked to raise about 13 infantry regiments, but it quickly raised up to 35, and was actually reputedly had the highest proportion of citizens in uniform of any of the northern states. The enlistment period was originally for 3 months. When it became clear that the war was not going to end in 3 months, the enlistment period gradually rose up to 3 years. By war's end, Ohio was beginning to fill its regimental ranks with draftees. If you look at Ohio Civil War, it's always, the 33rd OVI, Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Draft came very, very late in the war because people simply stopped volunteering. Over the course of the conflict, the state of Ohio raised nearly 200 voluntary infantry regiments, plus infantry. There was also cavalry, artillery, and sharpshooter units. In all, some 320,000 soldiers served in Ohio units at some point or other during the war. And when you think of 320,000, that's 320,000 uniforms, boots, and everything else. There's very little data about Jews in the Civil War, which, as I noted, may itself be the story, that these were just people enlisting. But there is some evidence, including a few diaries, and from these we might draw some conclusions. Overall, Jewish volunteers seem to have comported themselves well. Private David Urbanski of Piqua, for example, served in the 58th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, which was formed in February and was disbanded in January of '65. He was granted a Medal of Honor by Congress for gallantry at Shiloh and Vicksburg. In a speech read before the American Jewish Historical Society in Washington, D.C. in December 1894, Simon Wolf, who was a prominent, at that point, Washington lobbyist, he'll come back, I'll talk about him again in a minute, mentions a second Jewish soldier from Ohio who received a Medal of Honor, namely Henry Heller of the 66th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. This unit was mustered in late 1861 and served to the end of the war. Heller was cited for his bravery at the Battle of Chancellorsville. A few Jews also rose to quite considerable rank in American armies during the Civil War. Again, a phenomenon almost unheard of in Europe. Several Jews reached star rank in the Union Army, including a number of brevet brigadier generals. And brevets are field promotions. They're not official promotions, but they're people who were raised because the general got killed or something happened, and you promoted a colonel to become a general. None were from Ohio, however, but there were several Jewish brevet brigadiers. The closest was Marcus M. Siegel, an immigrant from the Rhineland who was living in Holmes County, somewhere near present-day Canton. He started his career in the 67th OVI and eventually rose to the rank of colonel in the 120th Ohio Infantry. Officers at that rank moved from regiment to regiment. He died of his wounds in a very fierce battle near Shaggy Point on the Red River in Louisiana in 1864, so pretty much close to the end of the war. We do know a good deal about him because he wrote copious letters home detailing his life in the military. He was, and these are wonderful letters, he was 32 years old when he died. We, of course, do not know if he would ever have been promoted to a star rank. However, he himself writes from Baton Rouge in April of 1864, quote, "I received a very kind and encouraging letter from Simon Wolf," the guy who in 1894 gave the speech, who gave me a very positive assurance that I will be starred, though it takes time, perseverance, money, and pluck. But he says it shall be done. I have a feeling there's an article in here somewhere, but anyway. Said Simon Wolf, quoted above, was a cousin of Spiegel's and was at that time a well-connected lawyer in Washington, D.C. I don't think he had risen to lobby rank quite yet. He later, interestingly, helped defend Grant against charges of anti-Semitism, so he was an active guy. Spiegel's daughter, Marcus Spiegel's daughter, also claimed in her memoirs that he was about to be made brigadier general, but she may have gotten it from this letter, so I don't know if that's an independent source. But these were, of course, exceptional cases, as they were for any group in the military. But they're worthy of a moment's reflection nonetheless. To quote Jacob Marcus, an American Jewish historian, his language here is kind of interesting, Jacob Marcus's language. It is a tribute to the United States that a German immigrant was able to rise to the command of a regiment in a little more than a decade after his arrival on these shores. He should have said a Jewish immigrant, but he didn't. Marcus goes on to say, his career is comparable to that of the German Jew Louis A. Gratz, who came to this country in 1861, a fortunate time, peddled for a few months, and then joined up as a soldier. Gratz was then 21 years of age, and just over a year by becoming commanding officer of a regiment of cavalry with the title of major. I mean, it's amazing how fast these people moved up in rank, and their being Jewish doesn't seem to always have been an issue. I think much more reflective of the Jewish situation is what I found in a letter from the soldier Moses Marks to Feist Marks back here in Cleveland. Moses, who was in an artillery unit, wrote in 1862 from somewhere near Nashville, Tennessee, something like this, and I'm quoting from a number of different letters, but basically, life in camp is dull, send more postage stamps and paper. You know, normal soldier letter. I'm homesick, you know, it's muddy out here, it's cold, I'm bored, send me paper, send me stamps. I came across another letter going the other way to Edward Marks from, he was in the 150th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. This was a regiment raised in Cleveland and was raised for 100 days. It left Cleveland in May of 1864 for garrison duty in Washington. So this was a unit raised for 3 months, 100 days, to do guard duty in Washington and come back. And there was a number of Ohio units that did that kind of short-term stint. The letter, barely 3 weeks into the deployment, shows the utter ordinariness of the Civil War at this time from the point of view of the civilians. And I was kind of disappointed because these home front letters in the South are very dramatic, but the war is going on there. The home front letters from the North so far, or at least Northeast Ohio, are really dull. They're almost as dull as the soldiers' letters. And the letter writer notes the following, which I think, again, there's probably an article in here somewhere just about attitudes. But here's what the letter says, and I'm summarizing, I'm using the letter's language, okay? Letter writer writes, I had a chance to go swimming today. A bunch of niggers went on strike because they wanted a nigger boss and not a white boss, and they were all fired. I'll send you more paper and postage stamps, right? This was from Amelia Marks. So it tells you something about attitudes and about how the war was looked at. I mean, it's an amazing letter. One searches the Marks family letters in vain for any reference to Judaism or religious observance. Moses Marks notes in at least one of his letters that he had a meal of franks and beans. I, of course, have no idea what sort of meat was in the franks, but I bet he didn't either. And by the way, these letters, some of them are amazing. These guys had lots of time on their hands, and they're writing about everything that's going on and where they're stationed, stuff you could never get along with in military letter today. We moved to this camp, there's so many of us, the artillery is over here. You know, I had franks and beans for dinner, you know. I mean, it's kind of interesting how loose this kind of stuff was. While I'm doing an aside, I also have to point back to what you said, which I found really interesting about telegraphy. If you think of tens of thousands of soldiers at one battle, spread over miles and miles across and in depth, tens of thousands of wagons of equipment, to keep that under one command really meant you had to rely on telegraphy. There was no way to keep all of this together without that. So I'm surprised to hear telegraphy wasn't considered part of the military. It was absolutely essential to keep this whole thing together. So anyway, you know, in terms of Marks, I went through all the letters. There's nothing Jewish about them at all. Spiegel, however, is a different story, so I'll share some of that with you. But not always in ways one would expect. So he's the one who was the colonel who was thinking he was going to be promoted. Some background is here. I need to make this background to understand the letter. Marcus was born in the village of Oppenheim, Germany, a small, unremarkable village in which his father, Moshe Spiegel, served as rabbi. And I have a hunch that he was not really a rabbi, but he served as the rabbi. It was a very small community. He was probably the closest to that they had to a, you know, kind of the intellectual of the community. But I'm not sure. One could hardly call his son, Marcus, who came over to America, as an observant Jew by any stretch of the imagination. But he did clearly have a sense of being part of the Jewish people. For example, consider the letter Spiegel wrote from near Woodstock, VA on 2 March 1862. And he writes, I had lots of fun since I am in the service, and more especially in Virginia with Yehudim. I generally know them by the name as well as Punim, and then I go in and take Chapman or Childs along, talk about buying, and then I say a Lashon HaKodesh word, probably a Yiddish word, and you ought to see them jump and ask, Yehuda? Yes, sir. And then and then he goes on with the letter. And they give me all the, he said, all the covet in the world, probably covet honor in the world. But he's making a joke out of it, you know, watch me shock these people when I say, oh, are you a Yehudi? He writes later on in September of 1862 from Suffolk, Virginia, I met today a lieutenant and it's not clear, Bior something, a Yehudi from Elzai who shed tears when he heard my name. He and his fathers were great friends of my dear father. He told me that the 25th of this month is Rosh Hashanah, and the 4th of next month is Yom, he spells it Sippur, but I think he means Kippur, right? C-I-P-U-R. He says there is a synagogue in Norfolk 12 miles from here. I shall go in all events. He's writing now to his wife. You and the children must keep both. Keep the children out of school the 25th and 6th, and the 3rd and the 4th. For my sake, let us pray to the Lord God of Israel for the deliverance of this once happy country. Interesting letter. I have one other short letter, and this is where my research has stopped so far. In another incident, and this is December of 1862, Spiegel was preparing to sail with his unit down the Mississippi. This is going to take him to Louisiana, where he's eventually going to die. He's going to get shot. He was walking along the shore and, quote, this is from the letter, saw a Yehuda and his wife. I remembered the Sabbath and decided to have a kosher lunch. So as my friend and his wife came close, I said, Happy Sabbath, dear people, frightening the poor gentleman and probably his wife being offered Happy Sabbath by a man in uniform with a sword, spurs, and so on and so forth. You can imagine what this meant from, you know, a European immigrant, right? This soldier, and he was at this point at least a lieutenant colonel. Later, at what he called a Shabbat Hanukkah lunch, he was suddenly, this is the amazing story. Now, this guy's from Oppenheim. This is why I mentioned this. It's a tiny little village. Later, at what he calls a Sabbath Hanukkah lunch, he was suddenly recognized by one of the other guests who exclaimed, Dear God, a son of Rabbi Moshe of Oppenheim is a lieutenant colonel. It's really amazing how small the Jewish world really is. So this is where I've gotten so far. Like I say, I want to now look at some of the more surrounding what happened in industrial and other kind of impact the Civil War might have had. Thank you. Should we sit up here?
Yeah, please. Please join Peter up here. And I have a mic that I'll take around to people who have questions and comments. And let me make just a brief comment on the papers. One of the guiding questions, I think, for this project in our discussions about the project and the publication and the seminar has stemmed from what we call here in Cleveland the Alsbacher document, which is without a doubt, I would say the most important document we have in the Jewish archives. This is an ethical will that was written by the Rabbi Lazarus Cohn of Unsleben, the religious teacher of that town, to the party of immigrants that came from this town in Bavaria that became the community's first permanent Jewish settlers. And in that document, he wrote basically a brief letter to these people, and then lists all of the people who came over in this small group of a small group of people. And he writes there, I know that you are going to this new country, but resist this tempting freedom to lose your identity and remain Jewish. And so it really is very nice to see Catherine start out with that very, very clearly, that this is exactly what she's exploring. And I think the themes in Peter's paper refer to that as well. So that really is just great to see. Let me just get the mic, and then we will, I'll take it around to whoever has questions or comments. I think this gentleman here, I saw his hand.
You referenced Grant's general order.
Right.
Which I've heard before, but can you refresh me?
So the problem was that there was a lot of smuggling going on back and forth out of Kentucky. Was what do you call it? It wasn't Union, Southern or Union. It was a border state.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Right.
So it was a border state, and so there was a lot of smuggling back and forth into Tennessee, and of course there were a lot of Jews doing that. Not only Jews, but Jews were a significant proportion, and he wanted to stop that. So he issued an order that all Jews had to leave his area of military command. He was at that time in Paducah, Kentucky. So that area of Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana had to evacuate. And this immediately was brought to the attention of Lincoln, and it was rescinded within days. And there was actually an apology from Lincoln. But it's sort of the one document in which Jews are singled out for expulsion. And given Jewish history, of course, that rang all kinds of bells. But that's what it was.
Did this hang over Grant for?
A little bit. I mean,
No, keep him from being president.
no, and I mean, it was almost immediately withdrawn, like I say, within a matter of days. He did it in a matter of just sort of in the heat of battle, you know. He never did anything else anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. You know, he had his defenders like the Simon Wolf. So it really, you know, we still remember it, and it's still kind of quoted every now and then, but it was one of these odd incidents that happened and was taken away, and it never really stuck to him.
The colonel that died in Louisiana,
Spiegel.
who was walking down the street, saw another Jewish couple, and said good day to them in the hopes of getting a cultured lunch.
Kosher
Oh, okay,
lunch.
kosher lunch. Okay.
This was not a guy keeping kosher in the Union Army.
Right.
He was
But
homesick.
Did he? Any indication that he got the lunch?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and he came back, and that's when he met this other guy. Says, "Oh my God, Rav Moshe's son is a lieutenant colonel."
Oh, so those events were connected.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, he seemed to have enjoyed going into these places where he recognized somebody who was Jewish and suddenly springing it on them. "Oh, are you a Yehudim?" And watching their faces, and he writes about it. Oh, they were so shocked. It was so funny.
Okay, Peter.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the context that being Jewish, as far as your evidence went, was no big deal with the Union soldiers from Ohio. Eventually, however, the issue of Jewish participation, Jewish soldiers in the Civil War, does become a big deal. And Simon Wolf in the 1890s coordinates a project to document, to the best of his ability, every single Jew to have served in the armies in the Civil War. And once again, this is not in the context of the 1860s. This is in the context of the 1890s, and when anti-Semitism has become a real issue in the United States. And one of the canards is that Jews did not serve their country in the Civil War. So once again, it's very interesting that in the context you're exploring, it isn't a big deal, but it's going to become a big deal.
Right. But I'm looking at what's going on in these. That was, by the way, the context of his speech in Washington about all the awards Jewish soldiers got. And you can tell from the list he was guessing who was Jewish because he guessed wrong in a number of cases, but that's another story.
One more question from.
By the way, I can add on to that a little bit. In the South, you know, there's a lot of Northern soldiers went to the South and liked it and stayed, and then became very active in politics. And they were carpetbaggers, right? But some of them became very prominent and became very prominent families and were accepted in the South. The first mayor of the first mayor of Knoxville, Tennessee, after the war was a Jewish carpetbagger, and he was elected into office. You know, it was a different time.
First, I have a short question about the letters of Edward to Leia.
Mm-hmm.
Did Leia, you have any letters from Leia back to
I haven't found them yet. I have not found them yet, but I haven't had enough time to look.
All right.
I'm not the former director of the Jewish Studies program, undergraduate director. I resumed it, so I've been so swamped
All
I
right.
haven't had
And-
time to do anything. Next year I'm on leave.
And
Yes.
second, about the Jews who made it to officer rank. There were, I think, 24% of the Union Army was either German-born or the sons of German-born. And there even were German-speaking regiments. Did the Jews, being seen more like Germans, rise in rank in the German-speaking regiments, or was it a general?
That's a good question. I'll have to look at that. That is a good question. Does John?
I was going to ask a question.
Oh, I thought he had an answer. That would.
I don't know if it would appear, just a sidebar on that question. We have the Franz Siegel papers at the Historical Society, and Siegel was the German general. It's not an Ohio group, but that might be answerable in some of the records there. But Catherine, I was pushing this German side again. Did you find the Colman and Rosewaters families associating with German fraternals or German singing societies or other organizations?
I don't know yet,
Okay.
but that's something I'll have to look at. I haven't yet done that groundwork.
Okay, yeah, that's very curious about how that
Yeah.
might have happened.
Yeah, and I mean, the Colmans were from Bavaria. The Rosewaters were from near Prague, so they didn't identify. They maybe identified as Austro-Hungarians, but not as Germans.
They were identified as Germans anyway.
Yeah, they were Jews and Czechs.
Yeah, but
But they would have
No,
been.
that
Czech,
yeah. No, well, actually, Rosewater. No, but when Edward Rosewater went to Omaha, one of the first newspaper projects he took on was to help found a Czech language newspaper, local newspaper for Czech, non-Jewish Czech immigrants. He was involved in that. And then later he founded and edited the Omaha Bee, which was one of the prominent Omaha papers. In English, obviously. But no, so why did you ask about the German association?
I'm just curious because there are certain things that happen in Cleveland, and we sort of call not local trivia, but when the Franco-Prussian War was prosecuted and won by the Prussians, the creation of the German Empire, I think it was the rabbi of either Anchekesed or Tiferet who gave one of the speeches at sort of the public celebration of that victory. And there's some, I only know this marginally with German-speaking Jews as to whether, were they in the Gesangverein at one point, the German Gesangverein. So, the choice of identity issue comes in here between Jewish and German and American.
Great. I'm going to get the reference that you just mentioned, and I'll see if and where it shows up in the materials I look at
I'm
in
actually
the
delighted
papers.
about the Rosewaters with the Czech community, because there's a very strong Czech community in Cleveland
Yeah.
at that point as well.
Well,
Let me just add, what I found also striking, I didn't say this, but it's probably in your letters too, but like say the Spiegel letters are in perfectly fluent English.
yes.
Not a hint of German. And he was an immigrant, right? Did you find the same?
Oh, yeah, no, I tried to say that I think that Rosewater came in 1854 at age 13. This is not even 10 years later, and he's writing like Charles Dickens.
No, it's amazing.
So how does he, kids learn languages better than, his parents probably didn't speak English or weren't as literate in English. He had so little education in English too, 3 months at a business school before he became a telegrapher. So he read and read, I don't know.
There's a question in the corner here.
Hi, quick question. Both of you have referred to the issue of draft versus volunteer. It seems to me there's a brief allusion to a third category, and that is the folks who paid a fee to avoid the draft. Do you have a breakdown of the Cleveland or Northeast Ohio Jewish community as to which categories were predominant?
I don't have statistics. I don't have that kind of information, but it would be an interesting thing to find out.
It's on my to-do list. I haven't had real time to do a lot of this because we're still in the middle of the semester and I have to deal with the little undergraduates. But once, well, we need the tuition, so it is
Can't
important.
imagine why. Yeah.
You can sympathize, right? But it's one of the, I don't know if I can find the information, but I'd like to find out which units Jews were in, whether drafts or volunteer, and see if I can do some correlations. I don't know if you have that information.
We do have, I think, complete lists of Jews from the area who served.
Okay, that would be helpful.
But I'm not sure how hard it will be to find from that.
Does it
who
list
volunteered and who drafted.
regimental affiliation?
It probably does list affiliation. So
To the regimental list.
yeah, yeah. And if we could, and we want to get over to the corner after this.
We're playing this back.
There's a, with respect to the Prague area, there's a good study of the casino in Prague, which was tied up with the development of Czech nationalism in the last half of the 19th century. It was for a long time all Germans belonged to the, and then as the Czech language became identified with Czech nationalism and separatism from the empire, the barrier between German Jews and German Gentiles broke down or remained lower in Prague for a long time because the Germans need every German speaker they could get. So language politics and national politics was very much an issue in the Czech lands, and that must have been something that people were aware of in Cleveland. So Gary Cohen wrote a book about that. I don't know the exact dates and how they would fit with your families, but it might be something you could check quickly.
Well, I'm always looking for traces of Yiddish. Yiddish is my specialty within Germanic languages, and I'm always looking for traces of Yiddish in the Rosewater Colman materials, and I haven't found much. And they don't seem to talk about language very much. So far, I would love, but I'm really interested in language politics, I would love to find
I knew Gary
this.
when he was a graduate student,
Yeah.
and I don't remember him talking about Yiddish as an alternative to German and Czech and Hungarian.
In those regions, Yiddish would have been the last resort. It would have been the lowest common denominator, I think.
There may have been a class dimension there,
But
too.
I'm interested in. I mentioned that because I'm very interested in language politics and language choices, and I haven't yet seen a sort of a reflection upon the use of English, for example. Or I would love to find something in the Rosewater and Colman materials where you see a transition from one language to another. But we're at the beginning of our projects.
So I have a question for you
there's
real
lots
quick.
to
So when
find,
Marcus
yeah.
Spiegel writes and he said, I saw these Yehudim and I said something in the Lashon Kodesh.
Okay,
was he
so-
talking Yiddish or Hebrew?
So Lashon Kodesh is the Hebraic element of Yiddish. Okay. So he would have probably said, hab rachmanas or something, have mercy, or I don't know, whatever.
What he said.
But it would be maybe a Hebraic word. So I think he would be thinking about Hebrew,
Rather
but
than Yiddish.
probably with an Ashkenazic Yiddish intonation and accent.
For about 38 years ago, I bought a house in Shaker Square area that was designed by Charles Colman as his residence. So we've lived there. In fact, we're selling it now. But in the basement, there was a steamer trunk that his family had brought over from Germany. At least that's the way I was told. And several years ago, I donated that to the Historical Society, and I believe it's now on display at the Maltz Museum.
Can I find out who you are after? And,
Sure.
I was going to mention when I ran out. I had too long a paper, so I tried to edit as I went along. But I was going to mention that when we go to the Maltz Museum later today, one of the key elements in the permanent collection, I believe, is Leia. Ella Strauss Coleman's trunk trousseau with her petticoats and her linens. That's what you donated.
No. The trunk that we had was actually somebody had just filled it with some lumps of coal. So it was otherwise empty when we donated it. But it is on display, or at least it was on display.
Yes, it still is.
Still is.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Also, in the crawl space in the attic, I found a copy of the Jewish Review and Observer that they had just stuffed there when they lived there. But that got me interested in the Colman family. It seemed very interesting to me. That's why, of course, I was here today.
Will you
I'll
come talk to
you
me
afterwards,
afterwards?
sure.
Oh my God, this is amazing.
Thank you. And
Can I
we-
buy your house? No, I'm just kidding.
Approximate to the research resources.
I was wondering, Catherine, about the language use. Were you surprised not to find the Yiddish, or is your hunch that, I mean, of course they wouldn't have written, used it to, when they were conscious of using language, but that it was sort of what they fell back on, in private spaces in their home?
I think that the Jews from Bukovan and in the Prague area were consciously pushing Yiddish away as much as possible. German had more prestige, although, as you said, the German speakers needed as many German speakers as possible, Jews or Gentiles in the Czech lands at that point. So I was, I guess, wishful thinking. I did find some family, some Bibles, the family Bibles in English with the New Testament and the Old Testament and the New Testament, but they the Rosewaters recorded family births and deaths in Hebrew letters, but with Germanic spellings. So it was like a Judeo-German recording, but they felt that they had to record these momentous family events in Hebrew letters to make them Jewish. But in the family Bible, which was, in 1850s or 1860s, American, at your local corner bookstore on Prospect or whatever, English Christian Bible. So yeah, but as Cynthia Ozick, misquoting Franz Kafka, wrote somewhere, you know more Yiddish than you think. And so I always feel that among the ancestors on this side of my family who I'm researching in this project, I will find traces of Yiddish, because Yiddish was the language of Ashkenazic Jews from the 10th century or 11th century until they started assimilating. Yeah.
One question back here.
I wanted to make a comment on the language and the speed with which these immigrants spoke English, and in a very interesting way contrast to what happens today in language policy. In our research, we looked at the Jews who became the architects of Jewish education in America. Most of them were immigrants from Europe who came as young teenagers. Within 4 to 6 years, they were at Columbia University and writing in absolutely perfect English. So their desire to become part of this country and its language was not unique to the Jews that you described in the Civil War, but was part of a much earlier migration, much more broadly. I thought that was an interesting commonality.
Well, it's a really interesting comment, and it's something I teach Jewish American literature as well as Yiddish literature and language at Penn, and I look at and study and write about and teach language, what kinds of English Jews write from the 18th century through the 21st century, immigrants and beyond. And anyway, you're making a slightly different and political, educational point, but I think about it in literary terms, but it's very interesting. I don't think Ella Colman, you see, I have, what the papers I found of Ella Colman so far, and this was a few years ago that I looked at them, when she after Samuel, her husband, died, she took over the family store at 4th and Prospect, and there are lots of records. I think her daughters helped her keep the store records, and maybe her sons-in-law too. They had, I don't know, 8, 10 daughters. It was sort of amazing. But it wasn't clear to me that Ella Colman was able to write. When she had to sign something, there was a couple of papers she signed with a circle, which is a Jewish way of, instead of making an X, which is a cross, right? Jews don't make crosses, so they would make a keikel, a circle, and on Ellis Island later, the immigration officers would would tell somebody, a Jew, to sign something, a Yiddish-speaking Jew, and the Jew wouldn't be able to write his or her name in English or whatever, and somebody would whisper, "Mach the keikel," and so the word, the pejorative word "keik" came out of this. This is at least the legendary etymology of the word, of the slur, would come out of the word for circle. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. It's just about 10:30. About time for a break. I wanted to make one last comment, if I could. Someone mentioned the Jewish Review and Observer, and I wanted to mention because the Cleveland Jewish News Foundation is one of our sponsors for this seminar, and they're taking on a very important project. They have already digitized the issues of the Cleveland Jewish News from 1964 on. Their two predecessor papers were the Jewish Review and Observer and the Jewish Independent. And they are digitizing those as well. And they've also taken on the task of the digitization of Die Jiddische Welt, the Yiddish newspaper from Cleveland that was published here for many decades. And we hope to see that in a few, let's say a few years to be safe. But that's a great, wonderful project that will make all of our research much, much easier. So thanks very much, and we'll adjourn until 11.